So now in part 5, we're going to look at tips for asynchronous learning. So this is learning that happens outside of class meeting times or any learning that's not teacher directed. So maybe one of the first things to take into account is what's the space that my students are working in when they're not in class meetings? Is their learning environment conducive to whatever activity they have to do? And one of the ways that you can kind of monitor the learning environments when we're not in the physical classroom is to have your students send you pictures of their setup. So maybe the first thing that's on the schedule every Monday morning is a 15-minute block where the students get their learning environment set up and they send the teacher a picture. You also want to maintain the routine of having a visual schedule with embedded clickable links. So when the student exits their class meeting and they go back to check their class schedule, they can just click on the asynchronous activity in order to be able to access it. In other words, they're redirected to the activity as opposed to having maybe to follow a set of instructions in order to access the activity. So we're reducing kind of the barrier for some students who have difficulty with multiple step instructions. We also want to set clear expectations of what student engagement looks like for asynchronous learning. And we talked about this in part 4 when we were doing synchronous group learning, that the teacher could open the lesson with reminding the students of what student engagement looks like in that classroom. And the same goes for offline learning. What is expected? Do the students have to submit something when they're done their asynchronous learning? Do they have to provide feedback to the teacher? What are the expectations for their engagement when they're working independently? Can also have students self-monitor their engagement in offline learning. So in the same way that we did it for synchronous group learning, where maybe a Google form goes out, or there's just a checklist that the student fills out about their degree of engagement in offline learning, you can do the same thing for asynchronous group learning sessions. We want to try as much as possible to assign activities that are close-ended, so activities that have a clear beginning and a clear end. We also want to provide checklists when we can avoid assigning a closed-ended activity, and maybe we have to assign an open-ended activity, and an example of this might be a group project. So the asynchronous activity is continued work on the group project. So this is pretty open-ended, right? What does that mean? What do they need to accomplish during that time? Maybe students are at different levels of progression throughout the group project, so you can't just set out one guideline for the whole class. So one way to monitor engagement in that context is to maybe have the students send you a picture of where they're at, or send you an updated Google document so that you can follow along with the work that's been done during that assigned period. For some students who have difficulty with executive functioning, or maybe just the student has difficulty with time management in general, you can have them use an analog clock to monitor progression of the activity when they're not in a class meeting, so when they're working independently. There are also some things that we want to avoid when assigning asynchronous work. And one of them is we want to avoid assigning asynchronous work when it's not already on the student's schedule. So if you've planned in the day that there's going to be certain asynchronous group activities, we really want to make sure that we're plugging those into the schedule in that embedded hyperlink, so that the student has a one-click access to the activity. We also want to avoid assigning work without also assigning clear expectations of what work completion looks like. So if I assign to my students that the asynchronous activity is to read online about your favorite country or a country that you want to visit, what does student engagement mean in that context? If I don't provide any guidelines, then it's difficult to follow up or to know to what degree the students completed that activity. Do they have to submit a summary report? Are they going to have a follow-up one-on-one Zoom session with the teacher to present the things that they learned? So we want to be really clear about what that should look like. We also want to avoid assigning activities that have a multi-step submission process. So I gave the example of, go to this website, download this activity, complete the activity, and then import the activity into your Google Classroom and submit it to your teacher. And without realizing it, some of the activities we assign do have multiple steps, and this is difficult for a large number of students. So as much as possible, we want to find activities that have a simple submission process. So if the student clicks on their visual schedule and they're brought to an activity, and all they have to do is complete the activity and press submit, and that directly provides feedback to the teacher, well, then that's going to be a lot easier. And lastly, we want to be mindful of the types of activities that we are assigning during asynchronous group learning and how we are going to evaluate those, right? So earlier we gave the example of setting expectations or setting criteria for engagement in offline learning and what needs to be completed. But then how do we evaluate that? We want to make sure that we're providing activities or assignments during asynchronous learning that are going to allow for an objective evaluation process. Earlier, we spoke about the idea of having students submit pictures of their learning environments. And when your students do this, if this is something that you think would be helpful, then there are a couple things that you want to look for. Where are your students' school supplies? So anything that they're going to need to have readily accessible for whatever activity is going on. Where are their materials for the current lesson that's happening? And then where are their materials for lessons that they're going to need in subsequent periods? So how do they get all of that organized? Is there a system in place? And for your students who use physical daily schedules, where do they keep that? Is that accessible to them? Do they have other visual cues or visual sequences that they need in order to function at an optimal level in a remote learning platform? And if so, where are those? We also talked about assigning activities that have a simple submission process and ideally a one-click submission process. So here are some examples of accounts that have teacher and student linked profiles where the teacher can assign specific activities to a class or to specific students. And as soon as that activity is completed, all the student needs to do is press submit and the teacher gets direct feedback. So they don't actually have to download anything or import their assignment into Google Classroom or another platform. As soon as they press submit on that website or on that app, the teacher gets the feedback, the teacher gets the data. So that's a great way to monitor progress with asynchronous activities and just in general in order to have accurate data of how your student is progressing with a given lesson or a given subject. So that wraps up part 5. In part 6, Jade Lawson, who is a colleague and another consultant for autism at the Lester B. Pearson School Board, is going to talk to us about some of the considerations for remote learning for students who are following a fully modified or CASP curriculum.